I just threw away a perfectly good yogurt because it expires today. Not yesterday, not a week ago, today. It smells fine, looks fine, tastes fine, but the date on the container says August 9th, and my brain is convinced that at midnight last night it magically transformed from safe food into a bacterial death trap. And it's not just expiration dates. I spent 20 minutes at the grocery store yesterday reading ingredient lists, trying to figure out if anything in my cart could potentially kill me. Preservatives that might cause cancer, artificial colors that could affect my brain, high fructose corn syrup that's supposedly destroying my metabolism. But then I start spiraling about organic food too. What if the organic labels are fake? What if there are still pesticides, but they're just not telling us? What if the natural ingredients are actually worse than the artificial ones because at least we know what's in the artificial stuff? And don't even get me started on restaurants. Every time I eat out, I imagine the kitchen staff not washing their hands, dropping food on the floor and putting it back on plates, using expired ingredients, cross-contaminating everything with allergens I don't even have.
Emily, you're worried about expiration dates. I've developed this completely irrational fear of choking on foods I've eaten thousands of times before. Like yesterday, I was eating a banana, and suddenly I became convinced that I was going to choke on it and die alone in my apartment.
But bananas are like the safest food on the planet.
I know, that's what makes it so crazy. But my brain started calculating the size of the pieces I was swallowing versus the diameter of my esophagus, and suddenly this soft, mushy fruit seemed like a choking hazard. And it's not just bananas. I've become afraid of eating nuts, grapes, even bread sometimes. Foods that normal people eat without thinking about it become these potential weapons that could lodge in my throat and kill me. But here's the really twisted part. I Googled choking statistics, and now I know that choking deaths are actually pretty rare, especially in healthy adults. But knowing the statistics doesn't make the fear go away when I'm actually trying to eat something.
Wait, you Googled choking statistics? That sounds like it would make it worse.
It did make it worse. Because now I also know exactly how long you have to perform the Heimlich maneuver before brain damage sets in. And I've started calculating whether anyone would be around to save me if I started choking.
You two are worried about expiration dates and choking? Let me tell you about the actual nightmare of industrial food production. Do you have any idea what goes into processed food manufacturing?
Please don't.
Factory farms pumping animals full of antibiotics and hormones. Vegetables grown in soil contaminated with heavy metals and forever chemicals. Fish that are basically swimming in microplastics and mercury.
I think I'm going to stop eating.
And the processing facilities. Do you know how many FDA violations happen every year? Rodent droppings in grain products, salmonella outbreaks that don't get caught until hundreds of people are sick, chemical contamination that takes months to discover. Plus, all the preservatives and additives that are banned in other countries but perfectly legal here. We're basically participating in a massive uncontrolled experiment on human health, and the results won't be clear for decades.
So my yogurt paranoia is actually reasonable?
Your yogurt is probably fine, but the larger food system is definitely something to be concerned about. Like, why do we accept that food poisoning is just a normal risk of eating at restaurants? Why are there acceptable levels of contamination in our food supply?
And what about all the things we don't even know we should be worried about? Like, what if there are new types of contamination that we haven't discovered yet?
Exactly. PFAS chemicals in food packaging, hormone disruptors in plastic containers, nanoparticles in processed foods that we don't understand the long-term effects of.
So I should be throwing away more yogurt, not less?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that individual expiration date anxiety is missing the bigger picture of systemic food safety issues that are much harder to avoid through personal choices.
But that's even more terrifying because at least I can control whether I eat expired yogurt. I can't control industrial farming practices or food manufacturing standards.
Right. And that's where the anxiety really kicks in, realizing that most food safety is completely out of your personal control, no matter how carefully you read labels or avoid certain ingredients.
So we're all just rolling the dice every time we eat anything?
Pretty much. But so is everyone else. And most people manage to eat food their entire lives without dying from it.
But what if we're the unlucky ones? What if this is the batch of lettuce with E. coli or the restaurant that didn't wash their hands properly?
And what is my perfectly safe-looking yogurt is actually the one container that somehow got contaminated during manufacturing?
See, this is the problem with food anxiety. Once you start thinking about all the ways food can be dangerous, it becomes impossible to eat anything without calculating risks.
And you can't just stop eating. It's not like other phobias where you can avoid the thing you're afraid of.
Right. We have to eat multiple times a day, every day, for our entire lives, while being aware that any of it could potentially make us sick.
And meanwhile, the food industry spends billions of dollars convincing us that their products are safe and healthy, even when they're not.
So how do you know what information to trust? How do you eat anything when you can't tell the difference between reasonable caution and paranoid anxiety?
And how do you enjoy food when every meal becomes a risk assessment?
Those are exactly the questions we need to be asking. But first, we need to figure out where rational food safety ends and irrational food anxiety begins.
WHOA. Okay, hold up. If you just heard that and you're now staring suspiciously at your lunch, wondering if it's plotting to kill you, let's take a breath here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cora. And yes, that was me having an existential crisis about choking on a banana while simultaneously Googling choking statistics to make myself feel worse.
I'm Gianna, and I just spent 6 minutes convincing everyone that the entire food system is a contaminated nightmare, which is probably not the most helpful way to start a conversation about food anxiety.
And I'm Emily, currently side-eyeing a perfectly good yogurt that I threw away because it expires today. So this is What Me Worry, episode 11, where we explore the bizarre world of food anxiety and our complicated relationship with eating.
The thing about food anxiety is that it takes something we have to do multiple times a day, eating, and turns it into a minefield of potential disasters.
Right. And unlike other phobias where you can avoid the thing you're afraid of, you can't just stop eating. So food anxiety becomes this constant background stress.
Plus, there are legitimate food safety concerns mixed in with completely irrational fears, which makes it really hard to tell when you're being appropriately cautious versus when you're spiraling.
Like, food poisoning is a real thing that actually happens to people. But so is eating expired yogurt and being completely fine.
And there really are problems with industrial food production and manufacturing standards. But there's also the fact that billions of people eat processed food every day without dying from it.
So today we're going to talk about food anxiety, from expiration date obsession to choking fears to restaurant kitchen paranoia.
We'll explore how to tell the difference between reasonable food safety and anxiety-driven food avoidance.
And we'll dig into the bigger picture of food system anxiety and how to stay informed about real issues without letting every food safety headline paralyze you.
Plus, we'll talk to Jade from Nevada, who wrote to us about avoiding restaurants entirely because she's convinced the kitchen staff don't wash their hands properly.
But first, let's acknowledge something important. If you've developed weird food fears or eating anxiety, you're definitely not alone in this.
Food anxiety has gotten worse for a lot of people, especially since the pandemic made everyone more aware of contamination and hygiene issues.
And we're bombarded with conflicting information about what's safe to eat, what's healthy, what's going to kill us, what we should be avoiding.
Plus, social media is full of people sharing their food fears and contamination horror stories, which can make your own anxiety feel more justified.
But here's the thing, most food is actually safer than it's ever been in human history, even with the legitimate concerns about industrial agriculture.
The challenge is learning to eat in a way that's reasonably careful without becoming so anxious that you can't enjoy food or function normally around eating.
And figuring out how to trust your body's ability to handle normal food exposure without needing to control every possible variable.
Because perfect food safety doesn't exist, and trying to achieve it usually makes you more anxious, not safer.
The goal isn't to become reckless about food safety. It's to find a middle ground between reasonable caution and debilitating anxiety.
Like, it's probably worth washing your fruits and vegetables, but you probably don't need to throw away perfectly good food because it expires today.
And it's worth being informed about food system issues, but you don't need to research every ingredient in food safety violation to eat a normal meal.
So let's talk about what reasonable food anxiety looks like versus what problematic food anxiety looks like.
and how to eat food without turning every meal into a risk assessment.
Because food is supposed to nourish you and bring you pleasure, not be a source of constant stress.
Even if that yogurt really is expired now. Let's talk about my yogurt situation, because I know throwing away food that expires today is probably excessive, but I genuinely can't eat something once I see that date, even if it looks and smells fine.
What exactly do you think is going to happen if you eat yogurt on its expiration date?
I don't know. Food poisoning? Getting sick? My brain just treats the expiration date like a hard deadline after which the food becomes toxic.
But here's the thing about expiration dates. They're not actually safety dates in most cases. They're quality dates set by manufacturers for optimal freshness, not danger thresholds.
Wait, what do you mean?
Most foods are perfectly safe to eat for days or even weeks past their expiration dates, especially if they've been stored properly. The dates are more about taste and texture than safety.
So Emily's yogurt probably would have been fine to eat?
Almost certainly, yogurt is fermented dairy. It's literally made by controlled bacterial growth. It's designed to last longer than the expiration date suggests.
But then why do they put expiration dates on everything if they don't mean anything?
Legal liability mostly. Companies want to limit their responsibility for food quality complaints, so they put conservative dates on products.
So I've been throwing away perfectly good food because of corporate legal strategies?
I do the same thing though. Like, if I see an expiration date that's passed, I can't eat it even if I know intellectually that it's probably fine.
That's because we've been trained to think of expiration dates as safety information when they're really just manufacturer suggestions.
But how are you supposed to know which foods are actually dangerous when expired versus which ones are just less fresh?
Use your senses. If something looks, smells, and tastes normal, it's probably fine. If it's discolored, smells off, or has visible mold, then don't eat it.
That makes sense for obvious signs of spoilage. But what about invisible bacteria or contamination?
Right. Like, what if it looks fine but has salmonella or something?
That's where you have to think about actual food safety risks versus anxiety-driven fears. Most foodborne illness comes from improper handling or temperature control, not from eating food a day past its expiration date.
So restaurants and food preparation are bigger risks than expired yogurt?
Generally, yes. But even restaurant food is statistically pretty safe. Millions of people eat out every day without getting sick.
But what about the horror stories you hear about food poisoning outbreaks?
Those make the news precisely because they're unusual. You don't hear about the billions of meals that get served safely every day.
So my food poisoning fears are probably overblown compared to the actual risk?
But how do you override the anxiety when you're actually looking at expired food? Like, knowing the statistics doesn't make the fear go away.
Try starting with low-stakes foods. Like, if your bread is a day past its expiration date but looks and smells fine, try eating it and notice that nothing bad happens.
That's exposure therapy for food anxiety?
Exactly. Gradually prove to yourself that expiration dates aren't death sentences.
What about foods that actually can be dangerous when expired, like meat or seafood?
Those are different categories. Proteins and dairy do have actual safety windows, but even then, the danger zone is usually several days past expiration, not the moment the clock strikes midnight.
So the rule is use your senses first and be more cautious with certain food categories.
And maybe research actual food safety guidelines instead of just following arbitrary dates?
Right. The USDA and FDA have actual food safety information that's much more nuanced than throw everything away on the expiration date.
I think part of my anxiety is that I don't trust my own judgment about food safety. Like, what if I think something smells fine, but I'm wrong?
Same. Like, what if my sense of smell isn't good enough to detect dangerous bacteria?
But you've been eating food your entire life and trusting your senses about it. How often have you actually gotten food poisoning from food you thought was safe?
Honestly, almost never. Most of the times I've gotten sick from food, it was from restaurants, not from anything I prepared at home.
Same here. I can't remember ever getting sick from expired food I ate at home.
So your track record for food safety judgment is actually pretty good, even if your anxiety tells you otherwise.
That's true. My anxiety assumes I'm terrible at judging food safety, but my actual experience suggests I'm reasonably good at it.
So maybe the goal is to trust our own experience and judgment more and arbitrary dates less?
And to remember that perfect food safety is impossible anyway. Even fresh food can occasionally be contaminated.
Right. Trying to eliminate all food risk just makes eating more stressful without actually making it much safer.
Plus, stress about eating probably isn't great for digestion anyway.
And if you're spending significant time and money throwing away perfectly good food because of expiration date anxiety, that's affecting your quality of life.
True. I probably throw away hundreds of dollars worth of food every year because of date paranoia.
So maybe we practice eating slightly expired food and see what actually happens versus what we fear will happen.
Starting with low-risk things like bread and yogurt that are a day or two past their dates.
And remembering that getting occasionally sick from food is a normal part of being human, not a catastrophic failure of personal food safety.
Okay, let's talk about my banana choking incident because I know it sounds ridiculous, but in the moment it felt completely terrifying.
What exactly happened? Like, what made you suddenly afraid of choking on a banana?
I was eating it normally, and then my brain just started calculating the size of the pieces I was swallowing and whether they were too big for my throat. Suddenly, this soft, mushy fruit seemed like a death trap.
That's interesting because bananas are actually one of the safest foods in terms of choking risk. They're soft, they break down easily, they're not the right size or shape to block airways.
I know, that's what makes it so crazy. But once the thought entered my head, I couldn't shake it.
Do you think it's actually about choking, or is choking just the specific fear that represents something bigger?
What do you mean?
Like, maybe it's about feeling vulnerable or out of control, and choking is just how that anxiety manifests around food.
That actually makes sense. Like, eating requires trust that your body will handle the food properly, and if you're generally anxious about bodily functions, eating becomes scary.
Plus, choking is one of those fears that feels rational because it's technically possible, even though it's statistically very unlikely for healthy adults eating normal foods.
Right. And when I Googled choking statistics to try to reassure myself, it actually made the fear worse because then I knew exactly how serious choking could be.
That's the problem with Googling anxiety-driven questions. You're not looking for balanced information, you're looking for confirmation of your fears.
And the internet is happy to provide detailed information about every possible way something could go wrong.
So how do you eat normally when you're afraid of choking? You can't just avoid all solid food.
Maybe start with foods that feel really safe and gradually work up to foods that trigger more anxiety.
And practice eating mindfully instead of anxiously. Like focus on the taste and texture instead of monitoring for choking signs.
That makes sense. When I'm scared of choking, I'm not really present for the eating experience. I'm just waiting for something to go wrong.
Speaking of eating experiences, let's talk about restaurant anxiety, because I know we all have weird fears about what happens in restaurant kitchens.
Oh God, yes. I imagine the worst possible hygiene scenarios every time I eat out.
What specifically do you worry about in restaurants?
Food handlers not washing their hands, dropping food on the floor and putting it back on plates, using expired ingredients, cross-contamination with allergens.
And just general cleanliness. Like, what if the surfaces aren't sanitized properly? What if the cooking temperature isn't high enough to kill bacteria?
But you've eaten at restaurants before and been fine, right? How often have you actually gotten food poisoning from restaurant food?
Honestly, not very often. Maybe a few times in my entire life, and I could never be sure it was the restaurant's fault.
Same. I've had stomach issues after eating out, but it could have been anything. Stress, eating too much, food I wasn't used to.
So your actual experience with restaurant safety is pretty good, even though you imagine all these horror scenarios.
But the thing is, you can't see what's happening in the kitchen, so you have to trust that they're following proper procedures.
And trust is hard when you're anxious about contamination.
True, but think about it this way. Restaurants have strong incentives to maintain food safety. Getting people sick is terrible for business.
Plus, health departments do inspections, and restaurants can lose their licenses for safety violations.
That's a good point. It's not like they're operating without any oversight.
And most restaurant workers don't want to poison their customers. They're just people doing their jobs, trying to serve good food.
So maybe the question is, how do you eat at restaurants without spiraling about worst-case scenarios?
I've been trying to focus on the actual meal instead of imagining what might have gone wrong in the kitchen.
That's smart. Like, judge the restaurant by the food they serve you, not by the horror scenarios you imagine.
And maybe choose restaurants that seem clean and well-managed, but don't expect perfect sterility.
Right. Reasonable caution without paranoid inspection of every surface.
Plus, remember that your immune system is designed to handle normal exposure to bacteria and germs. You don't need a completely sterile environment to eat safely.
And if you do occasionally get sick from restaurant food, that's unfortunate, but not catastrophic. Most food poisoning is unpleasant, but not dangerous.
So the goal is to enjoy dining out without letting contamination fears ruin the experience.
Exactly. Because avoiding restaurants entirely is a pretty big limitation on social life and food experiences.
And most of the time, the food is fine, the kitchen is reasonably clean, and you have a good meal without any drama.
It's just that anxiety brain focuses on the small possibility of problems instead of the large probability of everything being normal.
Which is why practicing eating out despite the anxiety can help retrain your brain about actual restaurant safety versus imaginary dangers.
Time for our guest segment, where we talk to someone dealing with their own food anxiety. Today, we're talking to Jade from Nevada. Jade, thanks for calling in.
Hi, everyone. So my problem is that I've basically stopped eating at restaurants because I'm convinced the kitchen staff don't wash their hands properly and I'm going to get food poisoning.
How long have you been avoiding restaurants?
About 6 months now. It started after I saw a news story about a food poisoning outbreak at a chain restaurant, and now I can't stop imagining all the ways restaurant kitchens could be contaminated.
Have you ever actually gotten food poisoning from a restaurant before?
Not that I can remember. I've had stomach issues sometimes, but nothing I could definitively trace to restaurant food.
So you're avoiding restaurants based on imagined risks rather than actual bad experiences?
I guess so. But the risks are real, right? Food poisoning outbreaks do happen at restaurants.
They do happen, but they're also pretty rare considering how many meals get served at restaurants every day.
What specifically do you imagine happening in restaurant kitchens that makes you feel unsafe?
Workers not washing their hands after using the bathroom, food sitting out at unsafe temperatures, cross-contamination between raw and cooked foods, dirty surfaces and equipment.
Those are all real food safety concerns, but restaurants have protocols and health department inspections specifically to prevent those problems.
But what if they're not following the protocols? What if the inspection happened months ago and now they're being careless?
Then you probably notice signs of poor food quality or cleanliness when you ate there.
Right. Restaurants that are genuinely unsafe usually have obvious indicators, dirty dining areas, off-tasting food, multiple customer complaints.
I never thought about judging restaurants by what I can actually observe instead of what I imagine might be happening behind the scenes.
Have you considered starting with restaurants that seem particularly clean and well-managed just to practice eating out again?
Maybe, but how do you tell which restaurants are actually safe versus which ones just look good on the surface?
Look at health department ratings if they're posted, read recent reviews, notice whether the dining area and bathrooms are clean and well maintained.
And trust your senses. If the food tastes fresh and properly prepared, that's usually a good sign about kitchen practices.
What about fast food versus sit-down restaurants? Are there safety differences?
Fast food actually has pretty standardized safety protocols because everything is corporate controlled. Sit-down restaurants can vary more, but most are still reasonably safe.
The bigger risk factor is probably how busy the restaurant is and how quickly they're turning over food, not the style of restaurant.
So I should look for restaurants that seem well-run rather than avoiding entire categories?
Exactly. And remember, millions of people eat at restaurants every day without getting sick. Your chance of having a problem at any given restaurant is very low.
Plus, completely avoiding restaurants means missing out on social experiences and food you enjoy.
That's true. I've been declining invitations to go out with friends, and it's starting to affect my relationships.
So the avoidance is creating social problems in addition to limiting your food options.
Yeah, I need to figure out how to manage the anxiety instead of just avoiding the situation entirely.
What if you started with one restaurant meal this week, somewhere that feels relatively safe to you?
I could probably try that. Maybe somewhere I've eaten before without problems.
And focus on enjoying the meal and the social experience instead of monitoring for contamination signs.
Thanks. This gives me a more balanced perspective on restaurant safety.
All right, everyone, homework time. This week we're doing the Food Fear Challenge.
Pick one food-related anxiety you've been dealing with, expiration date obsession, choking fears, restaurant avoidance, whatever applies to you.
Then practice doing the thing you've been avoiding in a small, manageable way. Eat something a day past its expiration date, or try one restaurant meal, or eat a food you've been afraid of choking on.
The goal isn't to become reckless about food safety. It's to prove to yourself that reasonable food risks are manageable.
And notice the difference between your anxiety predictions and what actually happens when you take the food risk.
Remember, perfect food safety doesn't exist, and trying to achieve it usually makes eating more stressful without making you meaningfully safer.
Your body is designed to handle normal food exposure. Trust it a little bit.
Thanks for listening to What Me Worry. I'm Cora.
I'm Emily.
I'm Gianna.
And I'm Jade, and I'm going to try eating at a restaurant this week.
We believe in you, Jade.
This was an AI scripted voice drama for entertainment and informational purposes only. If you're in crisis or need professional help, please call 988 or contact your local emergency services.
Take care of yourselves out there.
And remember, most food is trying to nourish you, not kill you.